Welcome to History Distilled. Today we're going to look at the Battle of Matson's Ford. Time is short, let's jump into it. December 1777, a bitter wind swept across the Pennsylvania countryside. Winter was coming. In Philadelphia, the British Army under General William Howe enjoyed the spoils of a captured city. Just miles away, George Washington's Continental Army was licking its wounds. They had just fought the British to a standstill at the Battle of White Marsh, a draining, multi-day struggle from December 5th to the 8th. For the Americans, it was a strategic victory of sorts. They had repelled a major British offensive, but it had cost them in energy and supplies. And the army was exhausted. It was an army on the brink. They were tired, hungry, ill-equipped for the brutal winter ahead. Their confidence, hard won in recent battles, was a fragile thing that could be easily broken by the harsh realities of the coming winter. It was with this backdrop on December 10th, Washington convened his Council of War. The question was not one of glory, conquest, battles. It was a question of survival. You see, the fighting season was over. The men had proven their resilience, but now they faced the demoralizing prospect of a winter of cold and hunger, while their enemies feasted in the capital. Their minds were turning from the battlefield to the challenges of building shelter and finding food. Where were they going to spend the winter? The decision was made to move the army west across the Schuylkill River. The river would serve as a barrier between them and the British in Philadelphia. From a position on the west bank of the river, they could protect the countryside from British foraging parties and stand guard over the fledgling American government now scattered between York and Reading. To get there, they needed a shallow place in the river, a natural crossing spot. And there they chose Matson's Ford for this purpose. This simple logistical decision set in motion a chain of events that would lead to an accidental, chaotic clash, a battle that history has largely forgotten, but one that would shape the legendary ordeal to come. Thus, on the cold morning of December 11th, the Continental Army struck its camp at White Marsh. They marched through Plymouth Meeting down the path of modern-day Butler Pike to the crossing at Matson's Ford. To secure this crucial passage, Washington sent an advance guard of about 1,000 Pennsylvania militia across the river under the command of Brigadier General James Potter. Potter's orders were to establish a screen to warn of any British movement. Potter set up 3 small outposts on the west side of the Schuylkill. One stood guard at Middle Ferry, where Market Street now crosses the river. A second watched the road from the Black Horse Inn. And the third, where Potter made his headquarters, was at Harrowing House. But the Americans were not the only ones on the move. That very same morning, British forces marched out of Philadelphia. Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis led a foraging expedition of roughly 3,500 soldiers. His mission was to strip the surrounding farms of food, livestock, supplies necessary to feed the king's army through the winter. And here we arrive at a critical fact. Both armies were moving blind. Washington was convinced the main British force was settled in for the winter in Philadelphia. Cornwallis had no idea that the entire Continental Army was marching directly toward his area of operations. He expected to encounter a few scattered militia patrols, but not an entire army. And it was this mutual ignorance, this failure of intelligence on both sides, that would have deadly consequences. This accident, however, was born from a much larger strategic misstep. You see, General Howe's entire Philadelphia campaign was a failure. Yes, he'd captured the American capital, but the war was no closer to being won. More critically, by focusing on Philadelphia, he had failed to support General John Burgoyne's army advancing from Canada, leading to a catastrophic British surrender at Saratoga back in October, a defeat that would ultimately bring France into the war on America's side. So, with no decisive victory achieved, these 2 large armies were left to wander the countryside in close proximity, pursuing secondary goals of wintering and foraging. With little intelligence and no clear objective, it was not a matter of if they would stumble into each other, but when. Before we jump into the battle, if you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing so you can be notified of future episodes. Now, let's get to the battle. Cornwallis's column crossed the Schuylkill at Middle Ferry and marched north straight into General Potter's first picket. The handful of American militiamen were stunned by the sight of thousands of professional soldiers bearing down on them. They fired a single volley before they fled. The British marched on. Moments later, they crashed into the second picket at the Black Horse Inn. That position too collapsed in confusion. But not before a rider spurred his horse, galloping madly toward Harrowing House, with the desperate news for General Potter: the British were coming, and they were coming in force. Potter, though vastly outnumbered, refused to just run. In a letter written just 4 days later, he described not a rout, but a desperate fighting retreat. On every hill we disputed the matter with them, he wrote. He deployed his regiments across the rolling hills of Lower Merion, using the terrain to his advantage. He would station a few regiments on a ridge to meet the British advance. As they were about to be overwhelmed, they would fall back, retreating behind a second line of militia, waiting on the next hill. 4 miles they fought this delaying action, trading space for time. It was a brave, professional attempt to slow a superior foe, an act for which General Washington himself would later commend Potter and his men, writing to Congress that they, quote, behaved with bravery and gave them every possible opposition. But bravery has its limits. The sheer weight of Cornwallis's column was too much to bear. The British light infantry, the German Jaegers, these were troops trained for this exact kind of broken terrain fighting. They relentlessly pressed the attack. The militia's orderly retreat began to fray. Then it broke as panic took hold. The fighting retreat dissolved into a chaotic scramble for safety through a deep hollow between the hills known as the Gulf. In their terror, some men threw away their muskets, their ammunition, anything that might slow them down. The American resistance collapsed. With the militia in full retreat, Cornwallis stopped his pursuit. He'd achieved his goal. The militia were gone. He commanded his troops to take the high ground in case they returned. It just so happened that these high grounds overlooked Matson's Ford. While Potter's men fought for their lives in the hills, a very different scene was unfolding at Matson's Ford. The vanguard of the Continental Army, 2 full divisions under the command of Major General John Sullivan, had reached the river. There was no permanent bridge here, only the cold, fast-flowing water of the Schuylkill. American engineers and soldiers worked feverishly, lashing heavy supply wagons together, end to end, to create a crude, temporary bridge across the river. It was a precarious, unsteady path, but it was the only way across. Slowly, carefully, the soldiers made their way onto the west bank. Soon, the majority of men had crossed the river. And then someone decided to look up. And what did they see in the heights that commanded the ford? The very ground Potter's militia was supposed to be holding? They didn't see the familiar sight of American troops. No, they saw the hills crawling with British redcoats. Cornwallis's army was there, in position, watching them openly. The Americans were shocked, to say the least. They had been caught in a vulnerable act of crossing a river. It looked like a perfectly executed trap, a catastrophic ambush in the making. General Sullivan, a commander whose career was marked by flashes of both personal bravery and moments of disastrous judgment, made a snap decision. He panicked. Believing the entire British army was poised to sweep down and annihilate his divided force, he gave the order to retreat. The soldiers who had just struggled to cross the river were now ordered to scramble back. In the ensuing chaos, the makeshift wagon bridge was torn apart, destroyed, cutting off the crossing entirely. The decision saved Sullivan's 2 divisions from what he perceived as an imminent threat. But it had sealed the fate of General Potter's men. It left the scattered, fleeing remnants of the Pennsylvania militia completely stranded on the wrong side of the river, alone with Cornwallis's army. General Potter was understandably furious. He watched as his escape route was destroyed, his support vanishing before his eyes. He would later write bitterly that, quote, if Valiant Sullivan had only used his 2 divisions to cover the militia's retreat, his men could have rallied, formed a proper line, and held their ground. Instead, Sullivan's panicked withdrawal left the militia to fend for themselves and gave the British free rein to plunder the country, which they did with great efficiency. This moment of crisis revealed a dangerous flaw in the American war effort up to this point. Sullivan's actions were not just a tactical error, they were a symptom of a deeper problem within the Continental Army's command structure. In the absence of direct orders from Washington, and clouded by the fog of war, subordinate commanders were left to their own devices. Lacking good intelligence and a clear picture of the battlefield, a general's nerve could fail, and a single hasty decision could have disastrous consequences for the entire army, and sometimes sowing bitter resentment among the officers. And so the Battle of Matson's Ford ended in a state of confused stalemate. Cornwallis and his men held the high ground west of the river. Washington's army was stuck on the east bank, its plan for crossing in tatters. So what was the cost of this skirmish? The numbers reported by each side show just how thick the fog of war really is. General Potter estimated his losses at 5 or 6 men killed, 20 wounded, another 20 taken prisoner, though he was careful to add that he was not able to ascertain the full extent of his losses. The British, on the other hand, told a very different story. Captain Johann Ewald, an officer with the German Jaegers, recorded in his diary that Cornwallis's force had captured about 160 Americans after they put up a stubborn resistance. British casualties were never officially reported, though Potter claimed they were higher than his own. And it is the vast differences in these numbers which tell a story in and of itself. Was Potter downplaying a disastrous rout to save face? Or did he genuinely not know the fate of his men, scattered for miles across the countryside? Was Ewald exaggerating a victory for his superiors? Or did his account include the scores of militia who simply deserted in the chaos and went home? The truth is lost to history. But what the numbers make clear is the sheer confusion of an 18th century battlefield, where information was unreliable, and the line between captured, killed, and deserted was often difficult to draw. The immediate consequence of the battle was that Washington's plan was ruined. Crossing at Matson Ford was now impossible. The army spent the next day camped in the hills, sending out scouting parties to determine Cornwallis's strength and intentions. Cornwallis, for his part, had no idea Washington was so close, so he continued foraging before eventually returning to Philly. Washington had no choice but to choose a different location to cross. Thus, the entire army marched several miles north along the river, and on the evening of December 12th, in the midst of a blinding snowstorm, these exhausted, freezing soldiers began to cross the Schuylkill at Swedes Ford, using another set of makeshift wagon bridges. Once across, they trudged to a temporary camp in the towering hills of Gulph Mills. This encampment at Gulph Mills from December 13th to the 19th was the direct result of the delay at Matson's Ford, and it was a horrifying preview of the winter to come. The soldiers had almost no food, they had no tents or blankets to protect them from the driving snow. Dr. Albigens Waldo, a surgeon with the army, captured the misery in his diary. "We are ordered to march over the river," he wrote. "It snows, I'm sick, eat nothing, no whiskey, no baggage. Lord, Lord, Lord." The next day he added, "Here all confusion, smoke, cold, hunger, and filthiness. A pox on my bad luck." These abysmal conditions drained the men of their last reserves of energy and morale. And right before the true test of their endurance was about to begin. It was from this wretched, freezing camp that Washington, after days of deliberation, made the decision to move his army to its final winter quarters, a windswept plateau known as Valley Forge. The legendary march to Valley Forge on December 19th was made incredibly harder, the suffering there much greater, and all because of the accidental battle that had occurred 8 days earlier. The story of Matson's Ford is a reminder that history's not just a collection of famous battles and heroic last stands. It's also a story of accidents, confusion, poor intelligence, small, brutal encounters that have profound and unforeseen consequences. Matson's Ford was the forgotten first trial on the unforgiving road to Valley Forge. I hope you enjoyed this look at the Battle of Matson's Ford. Let me know any thoughts you have in the comments below. If you found this video interesting or learned something new, please consider hitting the like button. And subscribe to my channel for more History Distilled episodes. Again, thanks for watching, and as always, have a great day if you want to.